No, I'll talk without it for now. That's fine. My name is Derrick Klaassen. I'm the conference manager here, and I'm very pleased to welcome back Jordan Peterson to present this time on self-deception. And Jordan, if you were here last time, you'll probably remember Jordan's presentation, and he is back with reinforcements from the University of Toronto. So what we'll do is, in terms of the logistics of the presentation, Jordan will go first, and then we will have the four cohorts afterwards in the order that they're listed in the program. So we're pleased then to welcome Matt Shane, Maja Djikic, Colin, DeYoung, and Raymond Mann afterwards, and they'll transition without any kind of introduction by me. So thank you very much, Jordan, and please proceed.
So I started working on the material that I'm going to show you today about 15 years ago, and much of what I'm going to talk about today, although not so much what my colleagues are going to talk about, is summarized in this book. So if you're interested, you can take a look at it after the talk. I got into what I'm going to talk to you about in a very circuitous way, I think, given the actual subject matter. I was interested in people's rationale for extreme acts of cruelty as a consequence of their group identification. Interested in what could possibly be so important about group identification that it would drive people to actions that seemed certainly not to be in their best interest, but also clearly not in the best interest of others. What was it about group identity that could conceivably be so important to human well-being that it could push people to commit acts that were so atrocious, not infrequently, that as a consequence of perpetrating them, they would suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. So in wartime post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, it's much more common to be afflicted with the disorder as a consequence of something that you did rather than something that you experienced. I started investigating the problem of belief from a variety of perspectives: humanistic, literary, neuropsychological, mythological, religious, and that led me in the final analysis to a study of self-deception and its relationship to group identity and atrocity. And in recent years, I've been reformulating the notion of self-deception in a manner that distinguishes it from the classic Freudian perspective. And the Freudian perspective is essentially that, or the classic philosophical descriptions of self-deception, go something like this with regards to the repression of memories, say, something you can be self-deceptive about, some traumatic memory. You have the memory, you've recorded it in the manner of a video recorder. It's accumulated emotions that makes its recall unbearable. As a consequence, it's put in a storage locale that's in some hypothetical psychic substrata, physiological substrata. There's another mechanism that keeps it repressed. Then there's another being, the ego, that's separated by this barrier or process or whatever it is that keeps you from the memory. We know a lot about memory now, and it's quite clear that the notion that your mind acts like a video camera, video recorder, is completely wrong, and also that the notion that you have a clear memory of trauma itself might be wrong. It seems more clear that if something has terrified you emotionally, the probability that you've encoded it properly is very, very low, and as a consequence, repression is more a feature of encoding problems than recall problems. And with regards to classic notions of self-deception per se, the idea has always been that the self-deceptive individual knows one thing which he or she refuses to admit to, and also another thing, and isn't willing or able to allow both of these conflicting and fully fledged beliefs into consciousness simultaneously. Well, I don't buy that either. I don't think that human belief and thought necessarily works on logical terms, and I don't think the problem of self-deception has much to do with incommensurability of two well-developed beliefs. It's something much more complex than that, and to explain how complex self-deception is, I'm going to take you on a little tour through a view of the world that's actually predicated more on religious belief than on classic objective materialistic beliefs. And I think it's necessary to do this because unless you understand the structure of the world from the phenomenological or religious perspective, you can't really get a good handle on self-deception. And there are very, very complicated reasons for this. So now I'm going to focus, because I'm interested in group identity, an atrocity committed in the name of group identity, it might seem odd that I'm going to focus on the individual, but I am going to focus on the individual because in the final analysis, I think that the processes that stabilize or destabilize groups or that lead them to commit atrocity or to act productively are dependent on individual modes of being. I read a recent book by David Landis. He's a professor emeritus at Harvard University. He wrote a book called The Wealth and Poverty of Nations, and one of the things he was trying to figure out is why was there such a difference in wealth between North and South America, given essentially a relatively equivalent distribution of so-called natural resources. And Landis, who's I suppose quite politically conservative in his viewpoint, although I don't think that's necessarily relevant, concluded that at least in part that the reason for the disparity in wealth was that the nations that were predicated on English common law traditions were wealthy and those that weren't. And the reason that the nations that were predicated on English common law traditions were wealthy was because people basically approached one another from a standpoint of trust. So the default position with regards to any interaction, financial or otherwise, in the English settled countries was trust. And that people tended by default to act in a trustworthy manner. That the locale of responsibility was clearly individual, and that was the reason for the disparity in wealth. And that's a perspective I buy. And there's other reasons I also believe that the individual is the proper locus of analysis, even with regards to group aggression. It's partly because our normal notions of individual interactions with regards to a group, I think, are kind of skewed by what would you call it, inappropriate mathematical model. There's 6 billion people in the world, right? And it's very easy for us to presume that we're one speck among 6 billion, and that the consequences of our individual actions for good or for evil, for lack of a better term, are swamped and dissolve into irrelevancy in the face of such an overwhelming mass of conspecifics of people like us. But I don't buy that either, and in fact I don't think there's really any matter of dispute about my perspective on this. I think it's just right. I think it's been demonstrated mathematically that it's correct. You know that if you know 1,000 people and you have the ability to directly affect 1,000 people in your life, which is undoubtedly an underestimate, especially for many people, and they know 1,000 people, then there's a connection of only 2 that separates you from 1,000,000 people, and a connection of only 3 that separates you from 1,000,000,000 people. And it certainly is the case that you stand in the middle of a network of associations rather than in a linear relationship to other people. And what that implies is that the consequences of your actions, despite the fact that perhaps those consequences are invisible to you as they wave outward like the ripples from a pebble, the consequences of your actions are much more potent than you might realize. And the actions of individuals can contribute in a non-trivial way to the stability or instability of any organization, no matter how large. And I think there's actually been dramatic illustrations of this in recent years, and illustrations that are so dramatic that they're really in some ways unbelievable. You can think of Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, for example, or Mandela in South Africa, or Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the Soviet Union. 3 individuals had unbelievably immense impact on the sort of net destiny of their states, despite the fact that they were often operating from positions of unbelievable weakness, apparent weakness. So that's another reason why I think the individual is a good locale of concern. Also, I guess it's because the individual is a tangible entity, unlike the group. The group never feels anything or thinks anything or experiences pain or anxiety, but the individual does. And more importantly than that, the group never acts. The individual always acts. So when you're talking about an entity that can be come to terms with in any real way is stuck with the individual. And there's more to it than that, of course. Juror Edelman has pointed out, this is quite interesting, I think, that there are more patterns of connections among your neurons than there are subatomic particles in the entire universe. And one of the things that indicates is that whatever you are is complex beyond description, certainly beyond your own description, but also beyond the description of anyone else. And that means that although you might have some conception of yourself as an entity bounded in a particular variety of ways, there's no reason to presume whatsoever that that conceptualization is comprehensive or even accurate, given your unbelievable complexity. There's far more to you than you think. And people box themselves in various ways and are unwilling to move forward courageously, I suppose, or to accept responsibility for things that they see as beyond their capabilities. But a lot of that is, well, I wouldn't precisely call it delusion, but certainly illusion. There's a lot more to us than meets the eye. And, you might think that people would be willing to, if that was true, we'd all see it, but we don't all see it, and that's partly because if there's more to you, there's more to your responsibilities, and that's not necessarily a comfortable thing to admit. Right? So people are often willing to sacrifice power, to accept powerlessness if it means they can sacrifice responsibility. So anyways, that's why I'm going to talk about the individual. Now, how I'm going to talk about the individual is I think, different than how the individual might be considered from a standard psychological perspective. I take a phenomenological perspective, and I think it's fundamentally aligned with a more or less traditional religious viewpoint, probably less rather than more. Phenomenological, what does that mean? Well, there's lots of ways of construing reality, and before you can have a discussion about what might reasonably be considered real, you have to be willing to discuss your axioms, what you're willing to accept as real. So I watch people for a long time to try to understand, despite what they might say about what they believe as real, there are things that they act as if are real constantly. And those include domains of experience that are outside of the normal sort of materialistic or objective realm. I'm not going to get metaphysical particularly here. I mean things that are very tangible from a subjective perspective. You're all affected by your emotions. Even though no one else can detect them, or certainly not feel them, perhaps they're detectable. You're affected by your anxiety. You're affected by your hope. Hope drives you forward. You certainly act as if your own pain is real. This occurrence is in the purely subjective realm of being, although they're difficult to come to terms with from an objective or scientific perspective, constitute the very ground of your subjective being, even if you're not philosophically comfortable with that assertion. You act as if your own motivations, your own dreams, your own emotions are real. And I'm going to presume for the purposes of this argument that everything that you experience, everything that you experience is real. So I'm starting from a perspective that's fundamentally non-objective and making the presupposition that what we call objective reality is a subset of phenomenological reality rather than the reverse. The reverse perspective is generally accepted, right? Objective reality is true. Subjective reality is epiphenomenal. I don't believe that, and I think it's which of those two positions you accept is relatively arbitrary. And I think you can get a lot farther with the phenomenological viewpoint, especially when you're trying to understand things like the commission of atrocity and the nature of individual responsibility. So I'm going to describe to you what I think is a good metaphorical rubric for the comprehension of phenomenological reality. And I think it's real helpful to know this because it helps you understand the deeper meaning of religious perspectives, for example, because religious perspectives are predicated on the notion that phenomenological reality is truly real, that the subjective is truly real, and that the constituent elements of the cosmos are the constituent elements that are experienced by each individual. And those constituent elements can't be described in a standard materialistic way, not entirely anyways. Like, for example, just to play it absolutely straight for 0.2 of a second, the standard materialistic perspective on a phenomena as key to our integral existence as consciousness is without merit whatsoever Psychology has nothing, virtually nothing, to say about consciousness. We know nothing about it. We don't know what it is. We don't know how it appears. We have no notion if it can interact causally with matter. We have no notion if it's an epiphenomena, if it's an emergent property, if it's something fundamental. We know nothing about it. We know it's associated with neural activity to some degree, but there's all sorts of neural activity that aren't associated with consciousness. We don't know how it appears or how it disappears, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a fundamental aspect of reality, as I'm sure you'd all agree. So the fact that the traditional view has nothing to say about a phenomena as important as consciousness, not to mention phenomena like emotions, the subjective sense of emotions, or even the subjective sense of something as simple as color perception, has to lead you to think that the viewpoint is in some way profoundly lacking, unless you're willing to relegate consciousness, for example, to the domain of irrelevancy, which seems, well, if you can't explain something, you shouldn't automatically presume that it's unimportant. That's not a valid game, right? You should presume that perhaps your theory about it's unimportant or incomplete. So, the phenomenological perspective that I'm just going to describe to you is action predicated rather than object predicated. It makes the presupposition, more or less reasonably, an existential presupposition that the world is best construed as a form for action, as a dramatic form, a form in which action takes place. And Shakespeare, of course, who was a great dramatist, capitalizes on this idea in this particular quote. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. The world can be construed as a form for action. And from this perspective, the objects that make up the world are more to be considered in the manner of stage props rather than as fundamental constituents. If you go see a play, you don't really care how the stage is set up. It's a nice, what would you call, it adds some character and flavor to the dramatic events, but you don't even need the props generally. If the action is sufficiently compelling, it'll carry you into a sense of identification with reality. With regards to dramatic representations, we accept them as real at the drop of a hat. We pay money, solid money, to line up and see movies. We buy novels. We look at dramatic representations of reality as so intrinsically valuable that we'll pay for the opportunity to immerse ourselves in them. It's a natural way for the human mind to work, to construe the environment as a place in which interesting stories can occur. It's so fundamental that children don't have to be taught to like stories. They know how to like stories automatically, and we use their facility and interest in stories to foster their ability to learn other things that aren't so intrinsically interesting. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. What's the nature of the stage? Well, the answer to that is something like, what's the nature of a story? As far as I'm concerned, this is the frame that makes up the simplest story. And the frame has the following components. It's an action-oriented frame, fundamentally. It says that no matter where you are, no matter what you're doing, no matter who you are, you're always viewing the world, a world which is, by the way, far too complicated to make complete sense of. You're always viewing the world through a particular kind of lens. And the lens is a motivated lens. You're never an impassionate observer, and you're never an objective observer. You're always a creature that's aimed at the fulfillment of certain goals. Now, and some of those goals are biologically predicated directly. You get hungry, you get thirsty. Your action is involuntarily oriented towards necessary goods, and some of those goals are more abstract. So you can be a soccer player and decide that the most important thing at this particular time is to put a small ball through a goal, despite the best attempts of a number of people to stop you from doing that. Abstract and divorced from biologically predicated goals, but still a frame. What does the frame consist of? Well, three elements fundamentally. Some theoretical conception, abstracted conception of the value and status of your current state of being, who you are, what you're doing, conceived of in contrast to a hypothetical ideal. Now, that ideal can be long-term, the stability of your family, the stability of your country, the desire to live a good life, or it can be something, as it most generally is, much more much closer to home, much less temporally distant. It can be your desire to walk to the door at the end of this talk, your desire to take an elevator, your desire to go get something to eat. The point is that to make sense out of an extraordinarily complex world, you parse out one potential state of being as preferable to the one that you currently inhabit, and then devote your actions and your intentions and your thoughts towards the fulfillment of that goal. And no matter where you look in the world, you're looking at it through the lens of this framework. We know, for example, from recent work in artificial intelligence, that the world as such is complex beyond your capacity to perceive it. So you look at a situation as simple as this room, and then you think, why is it that you're attending to what it is that you're attending, rather than to all of the other things that you could be attending to, which are essentially infinite number? Even the pattern on the carpet, fundamentally hideous as it is composed of an endless array of gradients of lights and patterns, and it has sufficient resolution and depth so that you could get entirely lost in its consideration. The same thing applies to the ceiling or the walls or to the people that are sitting beside you. And most of the work that you're doing, screening out all that so-called extraneous information, takes place outside of your conscious awareness. And it's a consequence of your entrapment in a frame of reference of this sort, the one currently operative being, in principle, you have less information about the subject of this talk than you might like. You're hoping that the talk will in fact provide some of that information. You're regarding the information that I'm theoretically putting forth as the most relevant piece of information to be attended to in this forum. And once you leave here, in all likelihood, all that you will remember, presuming that you remember something, will be something about the talk and not something about the color of the wallpaper or the color of the carpet. You're always screening out information. And you use a story to do that. This is the simplest story. It's the kind of story that children tell when they come back from school. I was here. I went from home to school, and I crossed the street by myself. That's just a little narrative frame. And we're exchanging these narrative frames all the time. They're units of information about how an action pattern might be constructed to obtain a desirable goal, or there are units of information about what a desirable goal might constitute, or there are units of information about our current state. And we're very interested in these kinds of stories. We tell them to each other all the time, constantly. That's because they're useful. They help us stabilize the structure of the world. Well, what happens when you're laying forth one of these little frames of reference? Well, there's only a limited number of things that can happen fundamentally. One is that you get where you're headed. As long as you're going to where you're headed and everything's working fine, you're happy. That's, in fact, the best definition of incentive, reward, or hope, or promise, or happiness that we know of now. The successful movement towards a desired goal. That is what positive emotion is. Accepting also that positive emotion is the sense you get when you attain a valid goal. Two kinds of happiness. The approach to a valid goal and its attainment. Incentive, reward, and satiation. What else can happen? You don't get where you're going. You're blocked in some manner. Frustrated, disappointed. An obstacle emerges that you didn't expect. What do you feel? Negative emotion. Negative emotion is withdrawal from the frame of reference, or the sense you get when your progress is being thwarted in some way. Good things can happen to you. They validate your frame of reference. Bad things can happen to you. They stop you from progressing. But there's one other category of things that can happen to you. And it's a category that psychology has been relatively blind with regards to theorizing. Apart from a few theorists, it's partly because most of our notions of emotion have been predicated on conditioning experiments, and conditioning experiments always look at very simple kinds of emotions, fear of a given object, for example. But most of our fears, human fears, aren't phobic. Most of our primary existential concerns aren't phobic. If you're afraid of mice, that's one thing, but it's a lot different from being terrified of the future, for example. It's a lot different from the sense you get when you're confronting the unknown. So let's say one other thing can happen to you on the way to a desired goal, and that's something you don't expect. What does it mean to confront something you don't expect? What it means is the thing that most particularly distinguishes human intelligence from machine intelligence. Machines can only deal with what they know. We have to deal with what we don't know. So you say, for example, you're thinking about your career, you go visit the doctor, you've had an ache in your side, he tells you that you've got a disease, a terrible disease that has a fatality rate of 50%. Up comes a world that you had never given any consideration to, really, a world that involves a much more fine-grained analysis of your physiological being than you might consider acceptable. A world in which all your future goals and your own self-conception have been completely turned astray. Why? Well, you're always laying over the world these simplified versions of reality, goal-directed simplifications. You have to do that because you're a limited processor, a limited capacity processor. But the world itself is far more complex than your conceptualizations of the world. But you only encounter that underlying complexity when your plans are insufficient. They're insufficient when something goes wrong in an unexpected way. You want to go to work, you go out into your driveway, you put the key in the ignition and turn it. It makes a terrible backfiring noise and then quits. And you think, I'm in my car going to work. But your thought is wrong because the thing that you just turned the key in is no longer a car. It's not a car when it isn't working. What is it? It's an obstacle to your progress to getting to work. It's an expensive nightmare. It's an argument with your mechanic. It's a set of unsolved problems. It's this complex array of constituent elements, none of which you've paid any attention to whatsoever, till they fail to work. And the car, or what was a car, is now the sudden revelation of all the complexity that makes up the world that you hadn't been taking into account when you were pursuing your narrow and specified goals. People are always encountering the unknown, and that's our most basic profound story. The fact that we lay out limited plans on the world and they're constantly disrupted by the incredible complexity that makes up our experience that's generally fundamentally ignored. Novelty. Most of the world's novel. Well, why is that? It's because the things we don't know outnumber the things we do know by orders of magnitude. We're like individuals standing on an island in an ocean, the ocean being the degree of uncertainty that our existence brings to us, that faces us with constantly. And the funny thing is, and of course this makes perfect sense, is despite the fact that there are things we don't know, we do know how to act when we're faced by things we don't know. And that's a very peculiar human capacity. And it's actually reasonably well understood. What happens when you encounter something you don't understand? Well, partly it depends on the magnitude of the plan that's disrupted. So, for example, if I'm walking down the hallway reading and I stumble lightly over a chair that someone's left there unexpectedly, the degree of negative emotion I feel is very minor because the plan that was disrupted was of a very short order, and it's easy for me to move the chair and continue on the way. Alternatively, if I've been involved in a business dealing with a trusted friend for 20 years and I encounter incontrovertible evidence that I've been betrayed, then all sorts of things immediately come up for grabs. Am I a reliable judge of character? Apparently not. How many games has this person been playing with me over the last 20 years? What does this mean for our continued relationship? How is the business going to survive in face of this violation? Endless axiomatic presuppositions are brought into question as a consequence of the emergence of this unexpected occurrence, and I respond with emotion. What are the emotions? Fundamentally, the first emotion is anxiety. Anxiety is our, first line defense against the unknown. Why? Well, what does anxiety do? It stops you. Why? Because if you don't know what the hell you're doing, you should quit. You should quit doing it. If the plan you laid out on the world and the interpretive strategy you're using results in the emergence of something unexpected, you shouldn't continue doing it. Why anxiety? Why should you be afraid? Because when you don't know where you are, you don't know what's going to happen to you. And where you are is a lot more complex than the sort of physical territory that you inhabit. It includes the complex network of relationships that surrounds you and the presuppositions that you use to bring order to the world. If a fundamental presupposition is violated, there's no indication whatsoever that you're properly protected against the complexity that makes up the world. Anxiety. That's what novelty produces. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that, in fact, and in fact, in some ways, it's a little bit worse, because when you encounter the unexpected, you don't just get anxious. Your body, in some ways, is smarter than that. That's a good way to conceptualize the mind. In some ways, it's like a nuclear reactor. The old limbic emotional centers are kind of always on, and they're very, very powerful. And the higher cortex, which is fundamentally an inhibitory structure, is like the rods that people place into the nuclear reactor to govern its power output. When you encounter something that's truly unexpected, all the inhibitory control over those fundamental motivational centers vanishes. Why? Well, because your brain presumes that if your higher cortex laying out these plans doesn't know what it's doing, it should be ignored. And what should you do when you don't know what to do? You should prepare. For what? You should prepare for any eventuality. You should prepare to approach, you should prepare to retreat, you should prepare to freeze, you should prepare to fight. And that's exactly what happens. Your underlying motivational systems are completely dysregulated, and that's a very, very, very stressful condition. It's not something you can sustain for a long period of time. It's very physiologically demanding. The consequences of a high arousal state like that are very physiologically detrimental. Increases in cortisol, for example, can actually destroy key parts of your limbic system and produce all sorts of long-term health consequences. Your body can't tolerate an extreme state of arousal like that. So one of the inferences from this line of theorizing is something like this. Intact frames of reference, intact structures of belief help human beings maintain emotional equilibrium. So if you mess around with the structure of someone's belief system, you dysregulate their emotions. Now, that happens in life as events come up that we don't predict, but it also happens from a philosophical or ideological perspective when we encounter arguments or alternative existential positions that aren't commensurate with our own. You mess around with someone's belief systems, you mess around with the structure that provides them with emotional regulation. If you don't know what you're doing, you face novelty. And novelty is extremely stressful. So, here's a more complicated story, and maybe it's one that's a little bit more interesting. You know, if you're walking down the hallway and you happen to stumble over a chair that someone's placed there, that's not a revolution. It doesn't require a revolution in thought. You just move the chair aside and you continue on your way. But there are forms of unexpected occurrences that violate your very sense of self. And what does that mean? Well, they violate the structure, the framework that you're using to interpret the world. So here's an example I use on my students. Pre-med students, they're striving diligently to get into medical school. And a precondition to get into medical school is to get a very good mark on the MCAT, the standardized examination for medical students. All right, people take the MCAT, but a certain proportion of them do very badly. Well, they expect to do well, but they do very badly, and that's very traumatic. Why? Well, they're not going to medical school. So the entire future lays itself open for reconsideration, right? They've got a plan, maybe they've been pursuing it for years, and the plan falls apart because a key element of the plan failed. But it's worse than that, because it isn't just going to medical school. They've already got a conception of themselves as a pre-med student, a certain level of intelligence, a certain level of competence, plus a history. You fail something like the MCAT, or maybe you get a divorce. Not only is your future in question and your present, but so is your past. Because your self-conception up to that point has been predicated on the notion that you are in a position to play this particular game. And a dramatic failure of that sort throws everything up for reconsideration. into this motivational chaos that underlies stability. That's a descent into the underworld from a narrative or literary perspective, right? That's a brief trip to the kingdom of the dead, or even to hell, when the entire structure of your beliefs disappears and is replaced instead by a nameless and vague apprehension of the present, of the future, and also of the past. Descent into chaos. Why don't people? You know, we know there are stories of enlightened people, right? There have, at least in principle, been people throughout history, rare people who've attained some pinnacle of clarity of consciousness. And we have a vague sense that something like that is attainable, but we also have the clear indication by looking around and within, perhaps, that level of clarity of consciousness and spiritual stability is very rarely reached. Well, you think, if it's such a wonderful mode of being, and if it's within our grasp, why wouldn't we bother with it? Well, you might think ignorance would be one barrier. We just simply don't know how to do it, and I think that that's a perfectly reasonably conceptualized obstacle, but there's more to it than that. You know, if what you're doing isn't right, and you encounter dramatic proof that it isn't right, and you encounter at the same time the necessity of having to reframe your beliefs, you also encounter the necessity of this sort of descent, because before you can learn anything, you have to give up what you've already got. And when you give up what you've already got, you don't just go nowhere. You go somewhere that's worse than nowhere. You go into a place that's characterized by profound emotional dysregulation and uncertainty. And that's a tremendous barrier to learning. Do you really want to know things that you really don't want to know, even if they're true? How many of your presuppositions are you willing to violate? Many of you have moved or switched relationships or switched jobs or had a catastrophe of one sort or another befall you. Is that something you do voluntarily in order to learn something painful that you need to learn? Well, you know, the answer to that is generally not. And I would never also say that you should go looking for trouble if you don't have to, because life will bring you more trouble than you know what to do with anyways. This is a barrier to progress, right? Because progress is not a linear process, but a process of descent and ascent, and sometimes not of ascent at all, sometimes just of descent. It is certainly the case that, as a variety of myths of voyage to the underworld have it, that if you descend, there's no necessary reason to presume that you will ascend again, because this chaotic domain truly is dangerous, and not just in a metaphorical manner. Barriers to knowledge, right? It's easier to cling to what you have than it is to face the fact that it didn't work, to suffer through the necessary dissolution of your current belief system, and then conceivably to reconstitute it. The temptation to merely continue to produce the same error over and over despite accumulating evidence that it isn't working is frequently overwhelming. That's an alchemical representation of chaos. I like it a lot better than the more prosaic representation I put forward, and for many, many reasons. The dragon or the serpent is a common mythological figure, and there's a variety of reasons for that. We're primates. Primates hate snakes. It's not surprising. A lot of them are poisonous. There are populations in the world that still lose up to 5% of their members a year, primate populations, as a consequence of snake bite. Snakes are dangerous. Reptiles are dangerous. And we have an intrinsic fascination with them. There's something about them that represents danger and the unknown. They're a logical, metaphorical representation for the domain of things that frighten us. This is not just a reptile either. This is a dragon. And a dragon's a very interesting figure for a variety of reasons. And one is because it's like a snake. It's a creature of matter. It crawls on the earth. It's a bird-like aspects too, right? It's got wings. It's a metaphorical representative of an amalgam of a material and spiritual domain. There's more to dragons as well. They shed their skin and they can be reborn. There's something eternal about them. And they also hoard treasure, which is a very peculiar attribute for a serpent. Well, why would something that represents the unknown, why would something that represents the domain of transformation and fear hoard treasure? So let's say your car breaks down, right? And, well, let's put it a little differently. Let's say you've been dependent your whole life, right? You had a father that took care of you, and then maybe you had a husband or a wife that took care of you. You never had to learn anything about cars at all. You're divorced, and your parents are dead, and you're having a hard time dealing with the world. And you go out and you stick your key in the ignition, and all the car does is growl and quit. What happens? Well, if you continue treating that object in your driveway as a car, you're going to suffer nothing but frustration. If you understand at some implicit level that it's been transformed into something you don't understand, you're halfway to a solution. And what's the solution? Well, you should learn something about the car, because maybe there's something simple wrong with it. Maybe the battery's dead, right? Maybe all you have to do is call a taxi cab. You've never had to do anything like that before. Maybe you have to deal with a mechanic. Maybe you have to look at the manual. Well, it's a funny thing, because then as you face the consequences of the unexpected occurrence with your car, you learn something about the car. And that's useful. You have knowledge that you can use again in the future, but interestingly enough as well, you also learn something about yourself. If you actually face the problem, you don't just shunt it off to someone else. You learn that despite the fact that you were dependent in the past, you have enough wherewithal to encounter something, a domain that had frightened you before, and to pull out a certain kind of personality strength as well as the capacity to reconstruct the thing that isn't working. What does this particular representation mean? It means that in the domain of chaos, which is a domain that you do not want to tread, there's tremendous danger, but there's also tremendous possibility for growth. Why? I don't want to give you a metaphysical answer. I want to give you a real answer. And the real answer is something like this. And it's really worth knowing, I think. It's about the only optimistic philosophical thought I've ever read that I could actually believe. What's the idea? Piaget, famous child developmentalist, said he was curious about where do you get your personality? It's not just going to spring full-fledged out of nothing. And the world doesn't work like that. It comes from somewhere. Well, there are biological constraints on what you're going to be, but you acquire something from the environment. Well, what do you acquire? Well, Piaget says, child's always laying out little plans in the world, and they fail. And when they fail, the child explores to try to account for the reason for the failure, to readjust his plan so that the next time they work. So what is he exploring? Well, his plan is a simplified conception of the world, but the real world lurks beneath it. When his plans fall through, the real world is revealed. When he investigates the real world, he finds patterns of interaction that he can incorporate into his own personality structure to deal ever more effectively with the future. So what that means is that if you fail, if you encounter something unexpected, and you explore the reasons for the unexpected occurrence, you can pull up information from the domain of complexity that was hidden by your plans to build your personality. And you can think of this concretely. So you're trying to establish a harmonious relationship with your spouse. And of course, they're always doing things that you neither expect nor like, because they come to the world with presuppositions that are unlike yours. And you have a variety of ways you can deal with that. You can say, fundamentally, to hell with you. I'm going to stick with my axioms, and I'll just lean on you for 20 years until you bend to fit the mold that I want you to fit. In which case, you're a totalitarian, your partner is doomed, and neither of you are going to learn anything. Or you can actually attempt to communicate with the person, to exchange information back and forth, to reformulate your axiom so that you're a little smarter as a consequence of the interaction, and so perhaps is your spouse. Of course, that also means that you have to be willing to take these voluntary dips into chaos now and then as you discover that your presuppositions about women are inaccurate, which, no doubt they are. Your presuppositions about men are inaccurate. There's things that you believe about yourself that are just completely wrong that your spouse is more than willing to discover and point out, no doubt because he or she has really no alternative. All that exchange of information, painful as it might be, actually constitutes the matter out of which you construct your own personality. Matter. And there's still remnants of that mode of thinking in our speech when we say something matters or you should pay attention to it because it matters. We're saying that there's a domain that you're going to encounter that's sufficiently rich so that you should pull the information out of it, because if you don't, you're going to be weak.
What was the philosophical insight? Listen.
Well, you'll have to listen more carefully.
I'm listening carefully. You summarize it that we are attentive to reality.
Just hang on a sec. That I was going to try to account for the relationship between self-deception and atrocity. And I've led you on a path that's relatively winding. And the point I was trying to make is something like this. The world's a lot more complicated than you can possibly consider. And virtually all of the time you don't see that complexity. What you see instead is the plan that you overlay on the complexity. And the plan's limited. And if the plan's working, then that's no problem whatsoever. You're right as far as you need to be right. Never completely right, because you can never be completely right, but right enough. The question is, what the hell do you do when things go wrong? And there's only a variety of answers to that, a limited variety. One is you give everything up. You allow your plans to collapse. So the problem with that is that you pay a big price for that, because without plans, you're immediately overwhelmed by just how complex the world is. You can't sit with nothing. You can never view the world without a conceptual structure. It's overwhelming, and it's truly overwhelming, not in some metaphorical sense, but it's overwhelming because if you don't constantly act on the world, you die. The consequences are grave. You can't give up everything without risking a tremendous amount. By the same token, you can't just stick to what you believed before, because if it didn't work, it doesn't work, and you need it to work. You need to have your plans made into reality, especially things that are fundamental. There are certain limitations to your being that have to be overcome in order for you to sustain yourself. I read an analysis by Northrop Frye of the Old Testament. And Northrop Frye reads the Old Testament something like this. He said, well, history opens in the Old Testament with the revelation of self-consciousness. That's the motif that underlies Genesis. Adam and Eve become self-conscious. They understand that they're limited and vulnerable. They understand that they're going to have to die. And that destroys their ability to live in complete harmony with, unconscious harmony with the natural world. That opens history. And you can read that historically or developmentally from a psychological perspective. Every human being at some point in their life has to come to grips with the fact that they're limited in a profound way. And that limitation makes the world a very uncomfortable place for people. Well, what happens in the Old Testament after the opening act of Genesis? Well, Frye says there's the construction of a sequence of states of being that are fundamentally political in nature. Right? The constant recreation of Israel as a political state. Well, what's a political state? It's a group of people bound by ethnic identity or even voluntary identity that bind together in order to make part of the world a stable and productive place. But what happens in the Old Testament? Well, these stable and productive places, these modes of being, constantly become obliterated and vanish. And the implicit point, perhaps, being that no state of being, no matter how well constituted, can offer a permanent solution to the problems of being. Why? Well, it's because no state of being is complete. Partly because we don't know the limits of human nature. Partly because the world is so complex that every solution seems to exhaust itself as a solution, right? Because the environment is so dynamic and so plastic that it constantly transforms itself. Even you think about something as simple as the purchase of a computer. You buy a computer, 3 years later, it's not a computer anymore. It's a piece of junk. You can't even give it away. Why? Well, because the environment that is underneath the computer has changed so dramatically that the thing isn't even useful as a tool. It doesn't matter how well constituted your static belief systems happen to be. The environment is so complex and dynamic that eventually they'll become outdated. And what that means is that no state of being, no collection of beliefs, no matter how carefully put together, can ever offer you a complete solution to the problem of being. So, what's the solution to that? Well, it's something like this, and this is a much more complete story. It says, no matter what structure you lay out on the world, there will be something coming from this underlying domain of complexity that emerges to disrupt it. That's a given. That's the story, a story that's relevant to everyone. The consequence of a forthright encounter with this domain of the unknown is the incorporation of new information that's provided by the unexpected event, its reintegration into the current system of belief, and the reconstruction of a new framework. That framework is equally disruptible. So what that implies is that the frame offers protection from chaos, but the process of constant confrontation with chaos, voluntary confrontation with chaos, offers more protection. The notion being that beliefs help structure your world, but they're disruptible, so you need something more than belief. You need to voluntarily participate in the process of encountering the unexpected things that disrupt your belief. And you have to understand that it isn't your identity and the collection of beliefs that you bring to bear in a particular situation that protect you, but your voluntary ability to confront the unknown, to pull in the information that it offers, and to constantly reconstitute your belief systems. And that means that belief is important, and that tradition is important, and that identity is important, but that it also has to be made always subordinate to the process of individual encounter with those aspects of being that constantly transcend belief. And this is a death and rebirth story, or a hero myth. And a hero myth is often represented like this. There's an old and damaged community, tradition, ethnic group, family, whatever. Some archaic and until now hidden danger emerges to threaten the structure of the community. An individual steps forth voluntarily to confront the emergent danger, and does so as a consequence, obtaining whatever treasure it is that the dragon guards and reconstructing the community. And that's a story that's an essential description of optimized human character. A character on which the stability of a state is necessarily predicated. Why? Well, a state is a collection of wisdom from the past, from the dead past. A collection of adages and behavioral patterns and philosophies and ideologies that have been handed down to us by people who encountered whatever complexity they had to encounter in the past and showed us a manner in which we might do the same. But the environment is incredibly dynamic, and that means that answers that are handed to us from the past are by their very nature insufficient. They have to be associated with something else, and that something else is a process. So what's the process? The process is, person's always tradition, but that's insufficient. Person also has to be this process of constant encounter with the underlying structure of the world and the incorporation into the person of that structure so that the state itself can flourish as a consequence of the influx of new information, and so that the person is not deadly dependent on the stability of their belief systems for their own emotional regulation. So what's the option if you don't put forth enough courage to confront those things that challenge your belief systems? You're backed into a corner. If you believe that the unexpected can offer you nothing but grief and misery, then the only thing you have to rely on to keep your emotions regulated is your accumulated beliefs. That's the sort of thing that turns you into a totalitarian. Anything I don't understand can do nothing but upset me. That's a terrible adage. What's self-deception? When you first encounter something unexpected, you don't bloody well understand it. Let's say your spouse does something that upsets you terribly. You don't have a clear picture of why. All you have is an emotional response, which might be anger and frustration and disappointment and anxiety. That's it. Well, why? Well, it's because your emotional systems are wired up to provide you with initial information about something that's unexpected, but they don't give you a detailed model. In order to come up with the detailed model, you have to explore. You have to ask questions. You have to find out what it was about your acting out your presuppositions that caused the traumatic or uncomfortable situation to arise. You have to find out how the other person is structured, and you have to incorporate that information into your belief systems in order so that the uncomfortable situation doesn't replicate itself. What if you don't? What if you don't? What if you stay in a damaged house? Well, what's wrong with a plan that doesn't work? Well, you don't get what you want. Well, worse than that, you don't get what you need. Well, what happens to you if you increasingly don't get what you want or don't get what you need? Well, life doesn't turn out very well. You're not hopeful, because hope means good things are happening to you on the way to a valued goal. You're chronically frustrated. You're chronically disappointed. The unexpected produces nothing as far as you're concerned, but the probability that the system you use to stabilize yourself is vulnerable. What happens if you torture an animal consistently? You never let it experience anything positive. All it gets, because the funny thing is, if your beliefs aren't working, it doesn't mean that you get to have an absence of anxiety or pain. That comes along for the ride. You can't get out of that no matter what you think. You're anxious, you're in pain, you're not hopeful, and things don't work out well for you. Well, you have a tendency to get not only rigid as you retreat more and more from any confrontation with the unknown, but also mean. People have enough trouble conceptualizing life with its severe intrinsic limitations as something intrinsically valuable. When it's working stably and well, when it's nothing but an endless array of self-induced failures, it's very easy for your sense of life to turn against itself and also to turn against anything else that happens to be alive. I wonder why people can commit terrible atrocities in the service of their belief. Well, there's a twofold reason. In part, one is they're not going to let go of those beliefs just because someone else offers them information that they can't incorporate, that they find threatening. But also, the fact of those alternative people who share different beliefs or who hold different belief systems, allows them to have a perfect target for their animosity and vengefulness and hatred. And so the moral that is pulled out of this story is that if you don't participate in this process and you end up rigidly ensconced in a damaged castle, your personality shrinks in proportion to the sort of wasteland that you produce around yourself, and you find yourself increasingly cruel and vengeful. And so I'm going to close this part of the talk with a quotation from Milton. I spent a lot of time looking at Milton's Paradise Lost, and the reason for that is in part is because Milton, who said he was going to justify the ways of God to man, a non-trivial ambition, was very, very interested in codifying thousands of years of mythological thinking about the nature of evil. And he produced his primary character, Satan as a consequence of the collection of these myths that were associated with Christianity but not canonical. And Satan's a very interesting character. He's associated with reason and the power of reason. Lucifer is the bringer of light, and light is often associated with illumination and reason. Satan's a very interesting character. He believes that he's the highest angel in God's heavenly kingdom. You translate that into psychological jargon, and you think, well, what would that possibly mean? A potent force, a potent spiritual force, a potent psychological force. We know that Satan is associated with the spirit of reason. Well, we also know there's nothing wrong with reason. It helps us with everything we do. So what would be the satanic aspect of reason? Well, you think in the French Revolution, the transformation of the Notre Dame Cathedral into a cathedral devoted to reason was the precursor to the reign of terror that followed the French Revolution. Well, reason itself isn't necessarily the problem. It's the tendency of reason to fall in love with its own constructions, to presume that the models that we have of reality at any given time, phenomenological reality, are so complete that we can do without a relationship to the real world, to the complexity that underlies things, and that we know everything that's worth knowing. Well, what's Milton's story? Satan foments rebellion in heaven, tries to replace this omniscient power. A consequence of that was his immediate descent into a hell. And Milton characterizes this hell in a very interesting way. He says, which way, this is Satan speaking, which way I fly is hell. Myself am hell, and in the lowest deep a lower deep, still threatening to devour me opens wide, to which the hell I suffer seems a heaven. It's very psychological. Well, how would you characterize this state of being? It's the place you end up when you refuse to admit to the insufficiency of your beliefs and representations and your own errors. Stubborn refusal to change in the face of evidence for insufficiency produces existence in a state that's indistinguishable from hell. You think, well, is that too religious or too metaphorical for people who have a more rational and objective grasp of reality to accept? And then you think about a place like the Soviet Union, right? Totalitarian belief system. What does that mean? The construction of an ideological representation, a frame of reference that presumed omniscience, right? A complete system. Nothing was allowed to exist outside of it. Particularly no evidence of suffering, so any evidence of suffering was immediately heretical. You couldn't complain publicly in the Soviet Union because that meant you weren't a good communist. And what happened in the Soviet Union as a consequence of the rise of this absolute totalitarian belief? Well, Solzhenitsyn estimated the death of 60 million people between 1919 and 1959. And he also said, why was the Soviet Union like that? He said, well, people kept lying. They kept deceiving themselves about the nature of reality, even about their own pain. They knew the bloody system wasn't working, but no one would say anything about it. It got worse and worse and worse and worse and worse, which essentially was a hell without any bottom. Why? He also said one person who stops lying can bring down a tyranny. And that's pretty interesting, especially given that in some sense what he actually managed to accomplish was precisely that. One more quote from Milton. Milton presumed that the suffering that his primary character underwent was voluntary in nature, that Satan could escape from this hell-like place he found himself merely by admitting to his own error. Immediately the suffering would be eradicated and a state of harmony would be replaced. His reaction to that was, farewell, happy fields. where joy forever dwells. Hail horrors, hail infernal world, and thou profoundest hell. Receive thy new possessor, one who brings a mind not to be changed by place or time. In order for human existence to lay itself out in some harmonious manner, two things have to take place. There has to be the imposition of tradition. What's tradition? It's a structure of belief in its constituent elements. It's the structure of belief that enables you to make sense out of the world. Partial sense, because you're always making partial sense out of the world. But that's not enough. And a human development that stops with pure identification with that tradition, with that system of beliefs, is always insufficient, because the world's more complicated than the beliefs. It has to be allied with something. What does it have to be allied with? The courage to forthrightly admit to and encounter individual vulnerability. A paradoxical thing, meaning that the more you're willing to admit to the mistakes you make, the more you're willing to explore as a consequence of recognizing those mistakes, the more information you gather from the complexity that underlies the world, and the more powerful your personality becomes. Well, life is paradoxical, right? It's got this immense, meaningful aspect combined intrinsically with an immense terror. Well, and the answer to the problem posed by that paradox, quite logically, could be paradoxical. The more you're willing to admit to individual vulnerability, the more you can overcome it. The less you're willing to admit to individual vulnerability and frailty, the more rigid you become, the more totalitarian your viewpoint, the more terrified you are of the world, the more you're revenge-seeking, and the more dangerous you are as an aspect or a unit of any given state. Self-deception. Self-deception means what I know is sufficient, nothing else exists, and there's nothing I have to do to transform myself in order to make myself or the world a better place. And the consequence of that is a never-ending spiral into a kind of suffering that seeks for its generalization. All right. There's 3 more talks. Sorry, there's 4 more talks. In our lab, we've been looking at different theoretical aspects of what I've just been describing, and also experimental aspects. We've been trying to discover means of identifying thought processes that are characteristic of self-deception, and trying to relate those thought processes to broader social trends and ideas. And so I'm going to introduce Matt Shane, and Matt's been doing some very interesting experimental work using paradigms that are designed to determine whether or not somebody's capable of learning from experience.
What I'm going to look at is 2 things. I'm going to give you some information regarding the ways in which we've been measuring self-deception in the laboratory, because one of the biggest questions regarding self-deception is exactly how can we measure, how can we evaluate, how do we do it without asking people to deceive themselves or to deceive themselves, which of course isn't going to work very well. So we've been using some methodologies in the lab. We have a promise words to evaluate self-deception, and I'll go through them. And I'll then go through how we've been using that methodology to investigate the connection between self-deception and impairment functioning, particularly in terms of mental cortisol levels, in terms of raise stress levels, and reduce immunodeficiency functioning. Okay, so the initial hypothesis that we're working with, which has been gone through already, is self-deceptive individuals will, so what we've been working on is self-deceptive individuals will tend to negatively balance information to less than the extent than positively balanced information. Positively balanced information, as has been discussed already, for the most part, signifies success. Success in both direct behavior. So when you receive positive information, it means that you've accomplished something that you were looking to accomplish in the first place. Negative information signals an error somewhere in the process, and it signifies that you are not able to attain the goal that you were attempting to attain. It implies that there's something that you don't conceptualize about the problem space that you were trying to act in, and that there's something that you need to reconfigure. So our hypothesis is that these self-deceptive individuals will tend less to negative information than to positive information. What I've done is I put together a computer paradigm that evaluates the willingness of individuals to pay attention to the negative or positive feedback. So they have to learn to either press a button or not press a button on the keyboard. And every time that they press, they're told whether or not they're right or wrong. And it says either right is wrong or wrong is bad. And based on this continuous feedback, they are supposed to try and learn what to do when you press and when not press on the space bar. The key to the task is that the amount of time that the feedback remains on the screen, even at the time it says either right or wrong, is self-regulated. So they have to press the space bar again to go on to the next trial. And in that way, we're able to gain an evaluation of how long they're willing to attend to information signifying that they did something correct, compared to information that signifies that they did something incorrect. And so, what I can show you here, what we've done is we've put self-deceptive individuals and non-self-deceptive individuals through this paradigm. Self-deception, in this case, we measured according to general personality questionnaires. I've used the repressed coping style types of literature measurements. Self-deceivers are considered either considered both low on self-reported anxiety and high on social desirability and conformity measures. So they rate themselves as very low in terms of how anxious they are, but they seem to be very concerned about the people thinking and how to conform to the environment and what is expected of them, etc. And so we put high anxious, low anxious, and these self-deceptive individuals through this task. And what we've done is we've measured how long they reflect on both the positive and negative feedback. And as you can see, the self-deceptive individuals, everybody reflects on the positive information to a similar degree. But what you can see is that the self-deceptive individuals reflect on the negative feedback less than the positive, than do the high anxious and low anxious individuals. Also, everybody reflects on the negative information more, but the self-deceptive individuals reflect on it to less than an extent more. And the statistics that are showing the significant values. Based on those reflection measures, we've come up with a calculation, that measures what I've termed post-stimulus reflective preference. And that essentially is their preference to either reflect on positive or negative information. It's calculated as the mean amount of time that they look at the negative information, the post-failure information, in ratio to the amount of time that they pay attention to the post-success information. And what we'll see is that the self-deceptive individuals show a much smaller reflective preference score for the negative information than do high and low anxious individuals. Now, what does this mean? It means they're not allocating a greater amount of processing resources to error than they do to success. non-allocated. When an indication of error presents itself in the environment, they continue on in the same way that they did previously. Whereas everybody else seems to, well, the way we're conceptualizing it, they pause, they stop, they think about it, they try to figure out what they did wrong. And in that case, in that way, attempt to correct whatever the dysfunctional behavior was in the first place. One thing I should point out here is this is the self-deceptive enhancement scale of the IDR. It's a personality measure that measures self-deceptive tendencies, and it accounted for a great deal of the variance in the reflection scores that were obtained on this task. So the amount of time that they reflect does seem to correlate with self-deceptive tendencies as well. Now, the other thing that so that's apparent, that's essentially how we're now conceptualizing self-deception. We're thinking that this may be able to become a cognitive measure, to some extent, of self-deceptive tendencies, rather than having to give a personality questionnaire and asking whether one is self-deceptive or not. We would put somebody through the task, and based on their preference to positive and negative information, we may be able to use this to measure, to evaluate one's level of self-deception to some extent. The other thing I want to look at, that I want to present in this talk, is the relationship between the reflection measures and between self-deception and the ability to learn. So on this task, what they have to do is they have to try to learn when to press and when not to press the spacebar. What actually happens is different numbers flash on the screen for trial as stimuli. So the number 15 comes on the screen, and they have to either press or not. And the 15 acts as a cue towards whether it is a go trial or a no-go trial, a trial where they should press or a trial where they shouldn't. So the 15 comes up, they press or they don't, and they receive feedback saying right or wrong. And based on that feedback, they know for next time what the contingency of trials that have a 15 come up are. And so what we evaluate is how well they learn the stimulus response contingencies of all the numbers in the task. There's 10 numbers, 5 of them are go stimuli, 5 of them are no stimuli. And what you can see is that self-deceivers, the ones who are not paying as much attention to the negative information, are performing far inferiorly on the task. They're making far more commission errors, which means that they're pressing the button on trials when they shouldn't be, to much greater extent than more anxious individuals. And again, the significance levels show that to be the case. So why, this has been gone through to some extent, but why does reduced reflection on the error impair learning? Well, actually, what I should show first, in terms of the correlation table, why does it cause impairments in learning? Well, the error information is what the information signaling error is where the information to correct behavior is contained. And by looking at positive information signifying success in your goal, is only going to provide you with information as to why you were right. You already know why you were right, because you were right. You knew what you were trying to do, you knew what your goal was, and you succeeded at it. And that means positive information signifies